Sarah, the ship is sinking. I'm trapped below deck with 1,177 of my brothers. The water is rising fast, and I can hear the steel groaning above me. If you find this letter, know that I loved you until my last breath." These desperate words were scrawled by 19-year-old Navy seaman Robert Chen on a piece of oil-stained paper as the USS Arizona burned around him on December 7, 1941. His trembling hands could barely hold the pencil as explosions rocked the massive battleship and smoke filled the compartments below. But in his heart, only one thing mattered: saying goodbye to the girl he'd planned to marry when he returned from Pearl Harbor. What Robert experienced in those final moments wasn't just personal tragedy, but the beginning of America's most devastating naval disaster. The attack on Pearl Harbor would claim 2,400 American lives in just 2 hours, but it was the USS Arizona that became the tomb for nearly half of those souls. Today, you'll hear the complete story through the eyes of survivors like Robert, whose diary was discovered 45 years later, hidden in a watertight container that somehow survived the inferno that consumed America's mightiest battleship. If these forgotten stories of history move you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more untold tales from the world's greatest conflicts. The morning of December 7, 1941, dawned with deceptive beauty over Pearl Harbor. The Hawaiian sun painted the waters of the Pacific a brilliant gold, and gentle trade winds carried the scent of plumeria blossoms across the naval base. For the 1,512 sailors aboard the USS Arizona, it was supposed to be a peaceful Sunday morning, a brief respite from the intensive training that had consumed their weeks. Many planned to attend church services, write letters home, or simply enjoy the tropical paradise that seemed a world away from the growing war in Europe and Asia. Robert Chen had awakened early, as was his habit since joining the Navy 18 months earlier. Born to Chinese immigrants in San Francisco's Chinatown, he had enlisted not just out of patriotic duty, but to prove that he belonged in America, that he could serve his country as proudly as any native-born citizen. His cramped bunk in the forward magazine was hardly luxurious, but it represented something precious: acceptance, purpose, and a future he was building with Sarah Wong, the girl he'd met at a church dance just before shipping out to Hawaii. The Arizona herself was a monument to American naval power, a 608-foot Leviathan displacing over 31,000 tons when fully loaded. Commissioned in 1916, she had served with distinction in World War I and now represented the backbone of America's Pacific Fleet. Her 12 14-inch guns could hurl shells weighing as much as a small automobile over 20 miles, while her massive armor plating seemed to make her virtually unsinkable. To the men who served aboard her, the Arizona wasn't just a ship. She was home, fortress, and symbol of American might all rolled into one. But beneath this facade of strength and routine lay an uncomfortable truth that few wanted to acknowledge. Tensions with Japan had been escalating for months, and intelligence reports suggested that something was brewing across the Pacific. Yet the senior command seemed strangely complacent, perhaps lulled by the distance between Hawaii and Japan, perhaps convinced that no enemy would dare strike at the heart of American naval power. This dangerous overconfidence would prove catastrophic in ways that none of them could imagine. As Robert prepared for morning mess call, he noticed an unusual amount of aircraft activity to the north. At first, he assumed it was an unscheduled training exercise, possibly involving the Army Air Corps units stationed at nearby airfields. But something about the formation patterns seemed wrong, too aggressive, too purposeful for a routine drill. He made a mental note to ask one of the senior petty officers about it later, never imagining that within minutes, his world would explode into flames and chaos. The first indication that something was terribly wrong came not from sirens or alarms, but from the distinctive whistle of falling bombs. Robert was climbing a ladder from the lower decks when the sound cut through the morning air like a knife, followed immediately by the thunderous crash of explosions from nearby Ford Island. Through a porthole, he caught his first glimpse of the attackers, sleek, single-engine aircraft bearing the rising sun emblem of Imperial Japan, diving toward the harbor with deadly precision. For a split second, the magnitude of what was happening simply didn't register. Pearl Harbor was supposed to be the most secure naval base in the Pacific, protected by distance, secrecy, and the assumption that no enemy would dare attempt such an audacious assault. Yet here were Japanese aircraft, dozens of them swarming over the harbor like angry hornets, dropping bombs and torpedoes with methodical efficiency. The age of American invulnerability had ended in the span of a heartbeat. What made the attack so devastating wasn't just the element of surprise, but the meticulous planning that had gone into it. For months, Japanese naval intelligence had studied every detail of Pearl Harbor's layout, memorizing the positions of fuel tanks, ammunition depots, and the precise moorings of America's most valuable warships. They knew that Sunday morning would find the maximum number of vessels in port, with many crew members either on shore leave or enjoying a leisurely breakfast aboard ship. It was the perfect moment to cripple America's Pacific Fleet in a single, overwhelming blow. The first wave of attackers focused primarily on the airfields, seeking to destroy American aircraft before they could mount any defense. Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, and Kaneohe Bay were struck simultaneously, with Japanese fighters strafing the neatly lined American planes that had been parked wingtip to prevent sabotage, an arrangement that made them perfect targets for aerial attack. Within minutes, over 180 American aircraft were destroyed or severely damaged, effectively eliminating any chance of immediate retaliation. But it was the second wave that brought devastation to Battleship Row, where 7 of America's mightiest warships sat moored along the southeast shore of Ford Island. The USS Arizona occupied berth F7, positioned between the repair ship USS Vestal and her sister battleship, the USS Nevada. From the perspective of Japanese bombardiers, she presented an irresistible target. Massive, stationary, and loaded with enough ammunition and fuel to create a spectacular explosion if struck in the right place. Robert and his shipmates rushed to their battle stations as general quarters sounded throughout the harbor. But nothing in their training had prepared them for the reality of aerial bombardment. The Arizona's anti-aircraft guns began firing desperately at the attacking planes, but the Japanese pilots pressed their attacks with suicidal determination. Torpedoes launched from Kate bombers struck the Oklahoma and West Virginia, while armor-piercing bombs converted from naval artillery shells crashed through the decks of multiple battleships. The noise was unlike anything Robert had ever experienced. A continuous thunder of explosions, the sharp crack of anti-aircraft fire, the screaming of aircraft engines, and above it all, the shouted orders of officers trying to coordinate a defense against an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. Smoke began to fill the air as fires broke out across the harbor, and the acrid smell of burning oil and cordite stung his eyes and throat. This was war in its most brutal and immediate form, and for the first time in his life, Robert understood that he might not see another sunrise. At exactly 8:06 a.m., 11 minutes after the attack began, a modified 16-inch armor-piercing shell dropped from a Nakajima B-5N Kate bomber struck the USS Arizona near her No. 2 gun turret. The bomb, originally designed to penetrate the thick armor of enemy battleships, punched through the Arizona's deck plating like it was made of paper, continuing its deadly trajectory into the forward ammunition magazine where over 1 million pounds of black powder and high explosives were stored. What happened next defied comprehension. The explosion that followed was visible from 20 miles away, a towering column of flame and smoke that rose over 1,000 feet into the Hawaiian sky. The blast was so powerful that it lifted the Arizona's entire forward superstructure into the air, hurling pieces of steel weighing several tons hundreds of yards from the ship. The force of the detonation was equivalent to roughly 2,000 tons of TNT, making it one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in maritime history. In a single instant, the pride of America's Pacific Fleet was transformed into a burning, twisted wreck. Robert Chen was in the forward magazine area when the bomb struck, along with hundreds of his shipmates who were frantically trying to supply ammunition to the ship's guns. The explosion occurred so close to their position that death came mercifully quick for most. They simply ceased to exist in the white-hot fury of detonating powder. But for those in adjacent compartments, the experience was far more horrific. Bulkheads buckled and twisted, trapping men in rapidly flooding spaces as superheated gases and flames swept through the ship's interior. The immediate aftermath of the explosion was a scene from Dante's Inferno. The Arizona's forward magazine and #1 gun turret simply vanished, replaced by a gaping crater that allowed seawater to pour into the ship's hull. Oil from ruptured fuel tanks spread across the harbor's surface, creating a burning slick that would continue to burn for over 2 days. Men who had been blown overboard found themselves swimming through flaming oil, desperately seeking any refuge from the hellish conditions that surrounded them. Have you ever wondered what goes through a sailor's mind in those final moments before a ship goes down? For the survivors still trapped aboard the Arizona, time seemed to move both impossibly fast and agonizingly slow. Among the few who managed to escape the forward sections was Seaman First Class Donald Stratton, who had been manning an anti-aircraft gun when the explosion occurred. Blown overboard by the blast, he found himself covered in burning oil, his skin already beginning to blister from the intense heat. Swimming toward the nearby USS Vestal, he could hear the screams of men still trapped aboard the Arizona, their voices gradually growing weaker as smoke and flames consumed the ship. It was a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The speed of the Arizona's destruction was perhaps the most shocking aspect of the disaster. One moment she had been a fully operational battleship with over 1,500 men aboard, and 11 minutes later she was a burning hulk settling into the harbor's mud with nearly 1,200 souls trapped forever within her steel hull. The psychological impact on the surviving crew members was devastating. These men had believed in the invincibility of American naval power, and watching their ship destroyed so easily shattered that faith completely. But perhaps most tragic of all were the men who survived the initial explosion only to find themselves trapped in compartments that were slowly filling with water or oil. Some managed to find air pockets where they survived for hours, even days, tapping on the hull to signal their presence to rescue workers above. Recovery teams worked frantically to cut through the Arizona's armor plating, but the ship's ammunition continued to cook off sporadically, making rescue operations extremely dangerous and often impossible. In the oil-stained water surrounding the Arizona's burning hulk, a different kind of tragedy was unfolding. Seaman Russell Lott had been blown clear of the ship when the magazine exploded, but unlike many of his shipmates, he had somehow avoided the worst of the burning oil slick. Treading water in the harbor, he could see other survivors clinging to debris, their faces blackened with soot and oil, their eyes wide with shock at what had just occurred. The air itself seemed to burn, thick with smoke and the acrid smell of cordite and aviation fuel. What made the rescue effort so perilous was not just the continuing Japanese attack, but the unstable condition of the Arizona herself. The ship's ammunition magazines continued to detonate sporadically, sending geysers of water and debris high into the air. Each explosion threatened to kill the very rescue workers who were desperately trying to reach survivors trapped within the wreckage. Motor launches and small boats darted between the burning ships, their crews displaying extraordinary courage as they pulled men from the flaming waters. The response from other ships in the harbor was immediate but chaotic. The USS Vestal, moored alongside the Arizona, was also severely damaged but managed to beach herself to avoid sinking. Her crew worked frantically to help Arizona survivors even as their own ship burned around them. The destroyer USS Shaw exploded in dry dock, adding to the inferno that was consuming Pearl Harbor. Everywhere Robert's surviving shipmates looked, they saw evidence of American naval power being systematically destroyed by an enemy they had underestimated. But it was the human cost that truly drove home the magnitude of the disaster. Bodies floated throughout the harbor, some burned beyond recognition, others still wearing the neat uniforms they had put on for what was supposed to be a peaceful Sunday morning. Hospital ships and medical personnel were overwhelmed by the number of casualties, many suffering from severe burns caused by flaming oil or steam from ruptured boilers. The pristine tropical paradise of Pearl Harbor had been transformed into a maritime graveyard. Among the most heart-wrenching aspects of the tragedy were the personal items that floated among the debris. Photographs of sweethearts and families, letters from home that would never be answered, wedding rings belonging to men who would never return to their brides. These intimate reminders of the lives lost made the attack personal in a way that casualty statistics never could. Each floating photograph represented not just a number, but a young man with dreams, hopes, and loved ones who would spend the rest of their lives wondering what their final moments were like. The rescue operations continued throughout the day, even as the second wave of Japanese attackers arrived to finish what the first wave had started. Hospital corpsmen and medical personnel worked under almost impossible conditions, treating severe burns, smoke inhalation, and traumatic injuries while bombs continued to fall around them. Many of the medical staff were themselves wounded while caring for others, but they refused to abandon their posts until every possible survivor had been rescued. Communication systems throughout the base had been severely damaged, making it nearly impossible to coordinate rescue efforts or even determine the full extent of the damage. Radio operators worked with jury-rigged equipment, trying to maintain contact with Washington and other Pacific commands, while emergency crews fought fires that seemed to spring up faster than they could be contained. The entire harbor was shrouded in smoke so thick that visibility was reduced to just a few yards, adding to the confusion and making rescue operations even more dangerous. As the sun set on December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor resembled a vision of the apocalypse. 7 battleships had been sunk or severely damaged, along with numerous cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels. Over 2,400 Americans were dead, with another 1,200 wounded. But it was the USS Arizona that had suffered the most catastrophic losses. 1,177 officers and enlisted men had perished when the ship exploded, making it the single deadliest attack on a U.S. naval vessel in history. Among the handful of Arizona survivors pulled from the water that day was Seaman First Class Lauren Bruner, who had managed to escape from the ship's mainmast after the explosion. Covered in burns and suffering from smoke inhalation, he was one of only 334 men to survive from the Arizona's crew of 1,512. In later interviews, Bruner would describe the sound of the magazine explosion as like the world ending, a thunderclap so powerful that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The psychological impact on the survivors was perhaps even more devastating than their physical injuries. These men had witnessed the destruction of what they considered the most powerful warship in the world, had seen their shipmates die in ways that defied description, and had come face to face with their own mortality in the most brutal manner possible. Many would suffer from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though in 1941 such conditions were barely understood and rarely treated. But the story of Robert Chen and his final letter remained unknown for decades. It wasn't until 1987, during renovation work on a memorial building at Pearl Harbor, that construction workers discovered a waterproof container wedged beneath a damaged section of the Arizona's superstructure. Inside was Robert's diary, its pages still legible despite having spent 46 years submerged in Pearl Harbor's waters. The final entry, written as the ship burned around him, provided a haunting first-hand account of those final moments aboard the Arizona. What do you think drove these young sailors to continue writing even as their world literally exploded around them? Their dedication to preserving their final thoughts speaks to something profound about the human spirit. The discovery of Robert's diary shed new light on the human dimension of the Pearl Harbor attack. His earlier entries revealed a young man who loved his country, missed his family, and dreamed of a future with the girl he'd left behind in San Francisco. But his final words, scrawled in pencil as water rose around him, captured something that official reports and military histories could never convey. The absolute terror and confusion of those final moments, mixed with an extraordinary courage and dignity in the face of certain death. The diary also revealed details about life aboard the Arizona that had never been documented elsewhere. Robert wrote about the camaraderie among the crew, the daily routines that gave structure to their lives, and the growing tension as relations with Japan deteriorated throughout 1941. His observations about the Hawaiian Islands, with their mix of cultures and stunning natural beauty, painted a picture of a young man who had found peace in paradise, only to have it shattered by the realities of global war. Perhaps most poignantly, the diary contained an unsent letter to Sarah Wong, written just days before the attack. In it, Robert had proposed marriage, asking her to wait for him until his tour of duty ended. He had planned to mail the letter on December 8th, never knowing that he would not live to see another day. Sarah, who had never stopped hoping for news of her beloved, was finally able to read his proposal when the diary was discovered, 46 years too late, but somehow still precious beyond measure. The USS Arizona remains where she sank on December 7th, 1941. Her rusted superstructure still visible above the waters of Pearl Harbor. She has become more than just a war grave. She is a monument to sacrifice, a reminder of the cost of unpreparedness, and a symbol of America's transformation from isolationist nation to global superpower. More than 1.5 million visitors come to pay their respects each year, many leaving flowers, letters, and personal mementos for the 1,177 men still entombed within her hull. The attack on Pearl Harbor achieved its immediate tactical objectives but proved to be a strategic disaster for Japan. Rather than demoralizing America into negotiating a peace settlement, the surprise attack united the American people in a way that months of political debate could never have accomplished. Remember Pearl Harbor became a rallying cry that would sustain the American war effort through 4 years of brutal combat across 2 oceans. The sleeping giant had indeed been awakened, and its anger was terrible to behold. For the families of the men lost aboard the Arizona, the decades following the attack brought a mixture of grief, pride, and an ongoing quest for understanding. Many never received their loved ones' remains, as the decision was made to leave the ship undisturbed as a war grave. This meant that traditional mourning rituals were impossible, leaving many relatives in a state of unresolved grief that lasted for decades. The discovery of personal items like Robert's diary provided some measure of closure, offering final glimpses into the thoughts and feelings of men whose lives were cut short so abruptly. The technological lessons learned from Pearl Harbor revolutionized naval warfare and military intelligence. The vulnerability of battleships to aerial attack led to the rise of aircraft carriers as the dominant force in naval combat, while the failure to detect the approaching Japanese fleet sparked major improvements in radar technology and intelligence analysis. The attack demonstrated that in modern warfare, no target was too distant or too well defended to be immune from surprise assault, a lesson that would prove crucial in the years ahead. Robert Chen's story, preserved in his water-stained diary, represents thousands of similar tales of sacrifice and heroism that emerged from that infamous day. His words remind us that behind every statistic, every casualty report, and every historical narrative are individual human beings with hopes, dreams, and loved ones who mourned their loss. The transformation of America from a reluctant participant to the arsenal of democracy was built on the sacrifices of young men like Robert, who gave their lives not for conquest or glory, but for the principles of freedom and democracy that they believed were worth dying for. Today, oil still seeps from the Arizona's fuel tanks, creating an iridescent sheen on the harbor's surface that visitors often call the tears of the Arizona. It serves as a perpetual reminder that some wounds never fully heal, some losses never stop hurting, and some sacrifices demand eternal remembrance. The ship that was meant to project American power across the Pacific instead became a symbol of vulnerability transformed into strength, of devastating loss converted into unshakable resolve. The final entry in Robert Chen's diary, written as his ship burned around him, concluded with these words: "Tell everyone back home that we fought bravely, that we loved our country, and that our deaths were not in vain. The Arizona may be sinking, but America will rise again, stronger than ever. This I believe with my last breath." 78 years later, his faith in America's resilience stands as perhaps the most fitting epitaph for all those who perished on that day of infamy, when paradise burned and a nation's destiny was forged in fire and sacrifice.